further, how did you get into like your career in science? How does it start?
I guess it was kind of by serendipity. I wanted to be a medical doctor. I wanted to be a pediatrician when I was little, and kind of most through my time in high school, I thought that's what I was going to do. But then when I was towards the end, so I grew up in Peru, right? And the school system is a little bit different than here. Like if you want to go to med school, you go right after you finish high school. And because a lot of the, there's not enough, how do you say, there's not enough spaces for everyone in one given year to get into a program. So a lot of times I would see my cousins that were studying medicine before they were able to get into the medical school. They had to take this entrance exam like multiple times, right? Because there is, let's say, 100 spots for like 1,000, 2,000 people applying, right? So I thought, you know, and then once they were in medical school, it would take them forever, right, to finish, because a lot of their schools, there would be all these, you know, there was a lot of social upheaval at the time. So there would be a lot of, how do you say, strikes, and it just seemed, and when you are young, like time is different, the way that you interpret time, right? Like now I feel like time just goes by flying, but then I thought, oh my God, what am I gonna do with studying like 10 years of my life to become a doctor? And so I decided, yeah, maybe that's not what I wanna do. And I was reading a magazine, and they had an article about genetic engineering and the way to the future. And that's how I decided I was going to study biology, because I thought that sounded really interesting. My school was, you know, we had the general curriculum where you learn the usual sciences, but we didn't have like, you know, now people, you guys have all, when you're in high school or even elementary school, sometimes you have all these like science camps and things, and you even learn about DNA, or you do even experiments when you're little, right? But I never had any of that exposure, right? So my closest exposure to that was, I had one of my friends was already in the university, and she was working with planarias. So she gave me these planarias to keep at home as pets, right? So they're like these little flat worms, right, that can regenerate. And so I would cut them and then put them, and I had like a ton of them. And then one time, and you feed them, whatever, right? But then one time I was trying to change the little tank. It was like a little jar, and then they all went down the drain. So that was pretty sad. But actually, I think that's how I got interested into, you know, thinking about biology and stuff. And so initially I was going to study plants, right? Because I wanted to do like genetic engineering in plants. And I guess my very naive idea was, because there is so much poor people in my country, was to like feed the poor. So I was gonna engineer this super duper plant to feed all these people. And then, you know, because of my family, we moved here, right? Some of us, and I, you know, none of the things that I was studying in Peru, they only allowed me to transfer some of my classes, but I had to restart everything. And that's when I really got excited about all the like developmental biology, right? Even then, I still didn't know I was going to end up doing what I'm doing now, studying the brain. But I just had this class on developmental biology, and I just thought it was the most fascinating class. And then I saw this ad to work as a lab assistant in a chemistry lab, and it was a biological chemistry lab. So it wasn't anything. Now, when I think about it, I don't think it's something that is exciting, but to me, like being able to do these experiments, and they weren't, you know, it was just growing bacteria and viruses, and it wasn't to me anything exciting. But now, but back then it was, right? I got really hooked into doing research, and that's how I decided to like pursue a PhD. And like my career has kind of, you know, gone from, I guess I always had an interest in developmental biology, and now it's more focused on how does the brain develops, basically. But I guess that's kind of like long story on how I ended up studying what I'm doing, right?
That's very interesting.
Wondering, what was I don't even know where to start. There's just like so much. Is there any advice you could give to some like young aspiring students who maybe want to get into research or in like research
In
the
neuroscience.
development? Like maybe particular classes they could take to get there, or like anything to help along the journey.
Yeah, so I think there are always different paths. Like I was saying, my path hasn't been straight. Like I didn't do any formal neuroscience training until I was in my postdoc, right? So I think a lot of people like now, right? There is people that are there is a neuroscience minor here and also a neuroscience major. So I think if that's something that you're really passionate about, I think definitely you should try to figure out if you want to switch majors or if you want to do the minor, right? Depending on where you are in your, progression in your career. In terms of getting into research, I would say, like, yes, ideally it would be great if you can get into a neuroscience lab, but I don't think as an undergrad, what you need is just the experience. What you need is to learn. If you like thinking about a problem, if you find that interesting, if you like reading about it, if once you get into the lab, if you find that exciting, right? Because at the end of the day, that's really what kind of drives us, right? Like every morning, like wanting to know, like, what is happening, like how did your experiments work, right? What did you learn about it, right? So I would say, and I always tell this to my people in my 302 class, that you should email every single professor, like go through people's wages, not web pages, sorry. Not just in biology, there is also the people in the School of Medicine, there is people in psychology, there is people in exercise science. Like I would look at all those departments and all the people that are doing different research and find things that you find interesting and apply to their labs, There is obviously a huge ratio of undergrads to faculty. So sometimes it's hard to take many students. But I think right now, if that's the career you want to pursue, is, if you want to do a master's or a doctoral studies, the most important thing is to get some, lab research experience for two reasons. Because it also helps you decide if that's what you want to do, but also it helps you find other faculty that get to know you better and they can write you letters of reference for your applications, right? The other thing is also there is a lot of summer programs in different places, not just in USC, right? Where they pay you for like a semester, not a semester, but a summer to do, research. So I think you should, take advantage of that, and look, like I just saw on Twitter, like UC Davis has one, the Society for Developmental Biology has some, and I think the time to apply to those things is around now, right? Because they're having a lot of deadlines, right? So definitely.
What was your most recent like research project or like study that you have like focused on, your recent one?
So we currently, the lab is working on this chromatin regulator that regulates the kind of chromatin landscape, right? And when you do that, you can regulate tons and thousands of genes, right? And you probably guys have talked about this epigenetics, right? You're in genetics class, right? So, so we work on one of those, and we have a recent paper that just got accepted for publication on how changes in this chromatin regulator regulates the morphology of the neurons, right? So we are pretty excited about that because it's novel. It's not, people think of these genes as these very general regulators of development. But we are finding that maybe at different stages of development in different cell types, some of these genes might have different functions, right? So I would say that's the one project that I'm pretty proud of. Specific question you had?
Mainly it's just like, how do you do your research basically? Like, do you work with patients or just with like patient information? Or like, how does your research process work? Because I'm kind of interested.
So I'm interested in obviously the neuronal development and the disease, right? We don't work with patients per se. We do have a close collaboration with a family organization of patients that have axonal mutations, but I have a clinical collaborator. So our kind of big plan that we're trying to get funded, but that one hasn't get funded yet, is that we're going to clinically characterize the patients that have these mutations and then take their blood and use their blood to make stem cells. And then those I'm going to study in my lab. That's the plan. So we do have patients eventually in the future, but right now what we're doing is just using genome editing to make lines that have patient-specific mutations. So, and the nice thing about that is, you know, let's say the phenotypes is really related to just the mutation. And I guess since you guys are studying genetics now, maybe this is relevant, right? So you would expect that maybe different, but then the patients don't all have the same phenotype, right? So is it because they have different mutations, or is it because there is also a contribution of the genetic background, right? So one way to study that is to make what we call isogenic lines. So basically, if you use the same original, like mother line, you can call it, right? The original line, that then you make different mutations on the same gene, right? Then maybe you can kind of start to twist a little bit that apart, right? So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, some of what we're doing.
Mhm.
What would you consider to be maybe like a positive result from your process? Yes. What do you want to happen?
Well, so what we hope is that there is not a lot known about how these chromatin regulators are regulating neuronal development in humans, right? And there are going to be differences between humans and mice, right? And what we can, like, obviously, we can recapitulate certain aspects of human neuronal development in a dish, right? It's not the same as having a mouse. But I think what we can learn from this is if we can identify phenotypes, and because we know quite a bit in terms of the biology in other systems for these chromatin regulators, we can probably use that knowledge to establish like therapeutic strategies, right? That we could maybe use to develop like personalized therapeutic strategies for these autism patients. So that's kind of like the end hope, the end goal, right? But it's, you know, a long time away.
Did you consider any other like career paths other than the one you're currently on? And what was kind of like this?
I did, yeah. I tried to go into industry. And I thought about consulting, but I don't think I would be a very good consultant because I don't think I'm very good at, you know, yeah, I don't think I would be a very good consultant. So I mean, they were all related to science, right? So going into industry or going into consulting, or maybe becoming like a staff scientist, right? But deep down, I always knew I would be happier being able to be my own boss and run my own research group than necessarily being under someone. So I think deep down, this is what I always knew I wanted to do, right? But yeah, definitely, I think it's important to be open, right? Because this is not the only career path that anyone can take, right? There are many things you can do with a biology degree, right? Besides research, like I have friends that are doing consulting, or friends that are working in industry, or are doing more of the management, or are doing even like scientific advertising, right? Or are doing like patent law. They get a PhD and they go to law school afterwards, or even friends that got their PhDs in science and now are in Wall Street and they're investment bankers. Yeah, because the PhD, what it does, it gives you it trains you to think, right? It trains you to take a problem apart. And you don't realize it, but that is really a very important skill to have, right? More than necessarily the knowledge that, you can think of a professor, you think, oh, they have all this knowledge because they know about all these science topics. But I think the one thing that for us is common when you get a PhD is you can take a problem and twist it apart, right? And that inquisitive mind, that critical thinking, and that is something that can be applied to a lot of different fields.
You said, how has like a woman in STEM either gave you an advantage, or has there been obstacles to that, and how has that changed your perspective and either made you like stronger as a person, and how has that like helped you?
Oh, you mean being a woman in STEM?
Yes.
So I think compared to other fields like physics or math, right, where there is very few women, I think I was lucky enough that at all levels in the labs where I was, the majority of the people, like in my graduate school lab, my boss was a woman, right? In my postdoc lab, the majority of the postdocs, we were women. I think I would say that there are definitely, I would say disadvantages, but there are definitely sometimes like bias, right? No one can deny that. There was a recent article in Cell where they show that a lot of the two positions when you publish a paper for a scientist is that you either want to be the corresponding author, so listed last, or the first author listed first, right? And they did an analysis, and it was basically only 17% of the papers published in Cell, I think, those were women, right? And it's like, why is that? Does it mean that maybe sometimes there is still a lot of like glass ceilings that we have to break, right? I think in this department, the representation of women in terms of faculty is pretty good. Like we have about, I would say, is 50-50, right? I mean, we have a female chair, which is fantastic, right? But I am also aware that that's not the case everywhere, right? I think in terms of me, personally, I think it's maybe it's being both a woman and a foreigner, right? Being Latina. Being at the places that I have been, because I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins and did my postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And while a lot of the labs that I was, again, they also were very international. So there was a lot of people from everywhere, which I loved. I was also pretty aware that there wasn't a lot of Latina women, at that time, right? I think there is a lot more of us now, right? And has it make it harder? I would say some of my first publications, I did get the comments of, because my last name is foreign, right? So some of my first reviews as an independent lab, I got comments as like, we needed to get someone that spoke English or whatever, right? But I think as you get more established, that it gets diminished, right?
So, would you say that was your biggest obstacle to overcome in your journey, or was there something maybe larger that you had to overcome to get you where you are in your career?
You mean being a woman and a Latina in science being my big? No, I don't think that I don't see that as an obstacle. this is who I am. In the contrary, it gives me a lot of, it is my identity, right? And I think that the biggest obstacle always is our own selves, you know, and I don't know if that makes sense. Our own fears, right? And I think I would say that, you know, at the very beginning was just learning the culture, right? Coming from a different country, learning the culture of the places that I have been. That has been probably the hardest thing to do. I think professionally, the biggest obstacle in my career was something that I did to myself, because I went from my PhD that was using frogs as a model system and studying how cells divide, to a lab where they did human genetics and they work in mouse to look at brain development. And I had no background in brain development whatsoever. And I remember telling someone, because I was going to this super fancy lab, that it was a lab that is what we call sink or swim, right? Where there is no hand holding, right? And to me, that was the biggest mistake, but I don't regret it, because I learned so much, and I established myself, you know, as a developmental cellular neuroscientist. But that was really hard, because I switched so many things, and it was basically like doing a second PhD, but without any of the normal, how do you say, like the support system that you have when you are doing a PhD. So yeah, so I would say that probably was one of the biggest obstacles to you know, to getting my career maybe established faster, right? Than if I would have stayed, like some people, like my PhD advisor, she did her PhD on these proteins that are in the centrosome and published. And then back then you could publish a Cell paper with like cloning a gene, right? And then she did her postdoc on purifying the proteins of the genes she identified, right? And so her career was all very streamlined and very, you know, basically studying the same, you know, things in the same system over time, right? And so it was easier for her to, super young, she was able to start her own lab, right? So it was different.
So with that experience, like that lab that you did with the neuroscience, what would you say that was the point in your career that made you more interested in pursuing something for neuroscience?
So when I decided to switch to that lab, right? When I decided to do my postdoc on that, it was basically towards the end of my PhD. I had this interesting finding, but because we were not neuroscientists, we didn't know what it meant, right? And we did not pursue it, right? But because of that, I became really interested in how do these proteins that regulate the microtubule cytoskeleton, how do they function in the brain, right? And to me, it was really fascinating. And I felt like there wasn't a lot of people working on that. And so this is why I decided to join the lab that I joined at Harvard, but not knowing anything. Pretty well.
So with that experience, like that lab that you did with the neuroscience, what would you say that was the point in your career that made you more interested in pursuing something for neuroscience?
So when I decided to switch to that lab, right? When I decided to do my postdoc on that, it was basically towards the end of my PhD. I had this interesting finding, but because we were not neuroscientists, we didn't know what it meant, right? And we did not pursue it, right? But because of that, I became really interested in how do these proteins that regulate the microtubule cytoskeleton, how do they function in the brain, right? And to me, it was really fascinating. And I felt like there wasn't a lot of people working on that. And so this is why I decided to join the lab that I joined at Harvard, but not knowing anything.
what is your next research? Like what is your next upcoming research that you are going to do? Like, do you have any ideas of what you would like to do in the future?
Yeah, so we just got a 5-year grant from the NIH to keep working on this chromatin regulator. But now we're looking at, instead of just knocking it down with like siRNAs, we're using CRISPR to make specific patient mutations. And we're looking at how does it affect the whole transcriptome? How does it affect the whole, chromatin landscape, right? And also, can we use these models as a way to rescue the phenotypes, right? And try to understand if this is something that we could use to help patients that have mutations in these genes.
Like looking back at your career, like, do you have any regrets? Like, is there anything you would have done differently?
I don't know. So maybe I know what I would have done differently. Maybe I would have chosen a lab that was working on frogs, so that at least I would have known the model system better. But you know what? It's hard to say that because the careers is not so much about. Yes, careers in science is like, okay, you publish and you get grants and whatever, but it's more than that to me, right? All the people that are my really, really close friends, I have met in all these places that I have been, right? And this is the people that I still collaborate with, that whenever I need anything, we have each other's back. And maybe I wouldn't have had that if I went to a different place, or maybe I would have, I don't know. No, I don't think. I guess, yeah, maybe work on frogs instead of mice. And then maybe having, like actually take, knowing that I was going to go into a lab where I didn't know anything about neuroscience, actually take classes, to learn more about the brain instead of, I learned, but it was, really like, it wasn't like taking a class. It was just reading a bunch of reviews and a bunch of papers. But at the beginning, I was completely lost because it was a combination of scientists and physicians. And so the physicians would present all these human cases, and then we show all these, MRIs of the brain, and I'll be like, sure, yes, I know where the corpus callosum is, yeah. So, but no, I, in general, no, I don't think I have like any real regrets. You only live once, so why have regrets?
Do you have a favorite memory here at the University of South Carolina? Like one memory, funny memory, or just something about your career?
So you mean related to my career? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I would say actually this year that, on the same day we find out that we were going to get the grant, right? That we applied for, which are pretty hard to get. And also that our paper on the story that I told you guys about was finally accepted in this pretty fancy journal. So that's pretty happy day. Yeah, I think it's, being here has been very special, right? But I guess, career-wise, that's probably a pretty good memory to have. Because usually, I guess, science sometimes is pretty hard. So a lot of times things don't work. Or like one of my friends used to say, 99% of the time things don't work. So you live for that 1%. So when these things happen, it's like something that you like to celebrate.
Everybody has talked highly of you So
Our TA also said you were like super sweet and we're like, you have to do her. And I
yeah,
was like, okay, let's just let it
Who is
over.
this? I don't know.
Matt Bruner.
Oh, he was in my STEM set class. Yeah, he's funny. Yeah, I was thinking
Yes,
like,
he
oh
is.
my God. Yeah, he's really good. Yeah.